In 1937, the delicate equilibrium in East Asia was shattered. Long-standing tensions between Japan and China, dating back to the Manchurian incident in 1931, flared into open conflict following a seemingly minor skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge near Peking. Despite no reported casualties, this incident was just the trigger Japan had been anticipating. Within days, Japanese forces escalated their assault, launching a fierce invasion across China and capturing major cities such as Peking, Tientsin, Shanghai, and ultimately Nanking, site of one of the war's gravest atrocities, the Nanking Massacre. This conflict came to be known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, an undeclared war that would span 8 years and claim the lives of over 20 million people. This video delves into the early years of the war, highlighting the collapse of Chinese defenses and the fragmentation of China into rival factions, as well as Japan's strategic missteps and the limitations of international diplomacy. We'll also look at how neutral countries like Sweden reacted, caught in the midst of rising pacifism, anti-colonial sentiment, and commercial interests in East Asia. By the end of 1938, the war had escalated into a global issue, militarily, politically, and morally, even as it failed to provoke significant intervention from the international community. 15 kilometers southwest of Peking stands the imposing stone arch bridge known as Lugoqiao, or the Marco Polo Bridge in the west. Since 1901, due to a colonial open-door policy and a multilateral treaty known as the Boxer Protocol, Japan had been allowed to station a military regiment in the area. For reasons that remain unclear, on July 7, 1937, several Japanese soldiers exchanged gunfire with Chinese troops. Although there were no injuries, this Marco Polo Bridge incident signaled a new phase of Japanese aggression in East Asia. Within days, General Sugiyama Hajime and the Japanese military took advantage of the incident to initiate hostilities against an opponent they had long desired to confront. Shanghai quickly turned into a battleground when expeditionary forces landed on the Chinese coast as part of the invasion. In Japan, the conflict was referred to as the China Incident, as both sides avoided official declarations of war. Such proclamations would have invoked U.S. neutrality laws, cutting them off from American arms and commodity markets. History now recalls the event as the Second Sino-Japanese War, a brutal conflict that spanned 8 years and claimed over 20 million lives. In the initial year, Japan achieved significant victories across the Asian continent, seizing vital population centers like Peking, Tientsin, and Tsingtao. While the international concession of Shanghai remained untouched, the Chinese territory quickly succumbed to the invading forces. Following their capture of Hangzhou, the Japanese marched toward Nanking, the republic's capital, which fell and was occupied on December 13th. This led to the horrific Nanking Massacre, the war's most infamous atrocity. As Nanking became indefensible, Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Chongqing, establishing it as the provisional capital of the republic. Meanwhile, Japan's invasion continued to escalate. With the fall of Canton in the autumn of 1938, Chiang's military position became increasingly precarious on multiple fronts. The foreign invasion empowered his internal adversary, the Chinese Communist Party. Once merely a political faction in the 1920s, the party gained control over several strongholds in the northwest, effectively splitting the nation into 3 regions: a nationalist area, a communist stronghold, and a zone under Japanese occupation. While Chiang and communist leader Mao Zedong worked together under the banner of the Popular Front, their rivalry persisted, including armed clashes. By the end of 1938, another political faction emerged as Wang Jingwei, the vice chairman of Chiang's Nationalist Party, defected to French Indochina and began advocating for peace with Japan. Tokyo seized the opportunity to weaken the nationalists, reaching an agreement with Wang in 1940 that positioned him as the head of a pro-Japanese government in Nanking. China didn't even attempt to notify the League of Nations until a month after hostilities began, still reeling from the fallout of the Manchukuo incident. It was only on August 30, 1937, that Chinese diplomats first appealed to Geneva, and on September 12 they urged for international action under various articles of the covenant. However, the League could only offer moral support and promised to explore the possibility of providing assistance. In October, the signatories of the 1922 Nine-Power Treaty, including Sweden, were urged to mediate in the conflict. A conference was called in Brussels, but Japan chose not to participate. The empire viewed the treaty as irrelevant and protested against the involvement of countries with no significant interests in East Asia. The conference concluded without yielding any substantial outcomes. A few additional resolutions were presented, but they had little impact. A year later, the Chongqing government turned to Geneva once again. This time, surprisingly, the Assembly reacted firmly, issuing a clear call for sanctions on September 30th, 1938. Despite this, no member acted on the resolution, and Japan cut all remaining ties with the League. It wasn't until early 1939 that the military situation for Chongqing began to stabilize. The Japanese invasion reached a standstill as various Chinese resistance movements adopted guerrilla tactics, and the vastness of China started to work in Chiang's favor. The more territory the Japanese occupied, the harder it became for them to secure long supply routes and maintain control. The imperial forces had not anticipated a drawn-out conflict. Since 1932, Rickard Sandler had been leading the UD as foreign minister, serving until 1939, with just a brief interruption in 1936. A social democrat, Sandler had never been part of the activist faction of his party and was not known for being particularly decisive. The notable diplomat Eric Boheman once referred to him as a sphinx with a sardonic smile uttering oracles, and British envoy Michael Pallaret described him as typically a mix of reticence and affability. In 1936, when pressed about Sweden's return to strict neutrality, Sandler argued that solidarity and neutrality could coexist. Sweden's commitment to the League didn't mean taking sides in disputes between great powers. 2 years later, he warned of a scenario where the League could transform into an alliance of nations, asserting that those demanding action in the name of democracy were actually fostering a dangerous divide. Sandler insisted that Sweden's top priority should be to avoid any conflict, including those involving the League. Determining the foreign minister's true stance on the future of a solidaristic foreign policy is challenging, likely known only to him. Yet, his lack of decisiveness was offset by his political insight. Back in the spring of 1937, Sandler alerted the Advisory Council for Foreign Affairs with a cautionary report highlighting the unpredictable chaos a Japanese army commander in northern China could create. While Sandler often wavered, his fellow party member Östen Undén remained a firm advocate for a collective security strategy. Having played a pivotal role in Swedish foreign policy in Geneva during previous crises, he still believed in the League's ability to manage the great powers and continued to influence Swedish diplomacy even after leaving the government. As conflict broke out in China, Sweden found itself with limited choices. Either continue pursuing the path it had taken during the Manchurian and Abyssinian crises through the League, advocating for decisive collective security measures, or revert to traditional Swedish neutrality to avoid further confrontation. Perspectives on the military situation varied widely. Intelligence suggested that China had a newfound strength and that Japan would face challenges in its invasion. A military attaché noted the surprising unity among the Chinese in the face of war, while Japan struggled with significant divisions between its military and civilian sectors. Consequently, Swedish foreign policymakers found themselves without a unified response to the renewed threat from Japan. The official position of the Swedish government emerged gradually and culminated in a report in 1938, which assigned full responsibility for the conflict to Japan, accusing it of seizing an opportunity to dominate China, while the European great powers and the United States were overwhelmed with their own issues. However, while the report condemned the bombing of cities, a relatively new tactic in warfare, as a breach of international law, it notably omitted mention of atrocities like the Nanking Massacre, instead dedicating considerable attention to Japan's violations of Western interests. The main worry of the UD, reflecting the colonial mindset of the business community, was that Japanese interests would overshadow those of whites in East Asia. Sandler expressed a similar concern in 1939, suggesting that the vastness of ancient China could swallow its conquerors. He warned that if China managed to win the war independently, it could emerge as a great power, ungrateful to Western nations. Regardless of the conflict's outcome, Sweden would feel the repercussions. Official policies in Sweden largely adhered to international customs and were shaped by foreign policy objectives, while public opinion remained much more dynamic. Even in 1937, perspectives on Japan differed significantly across societal groups. However, unlike in 1931, opinions this time would shift rapidly. It's essential to remember that the events in East Asia unfolded against a backdrop of significant international change, including economic deglobalization, rising dictatorships, rearmament, and ongoing political turmoil in Europe. This swift transformation in Europe sheds light on the puzzling shifts in Swedish public opinion between 1937 and 1939. Passionate pacifists, such as Lindhagen, ceased their condemnation of Japanese expansion, while staunch advocates of the League of Nations, including Prime Minister Hansen, shifted towards neutrality. A pro-business editor-in-chief, Torgny Segerstedt, who once accepted the presence of the Kanto army in Manchuria, became a vocal critic of Japan, and politicians who had previously warned against the Yellow Peril began to champion the notion of Asia for Asians. Another telling figure was explorer Sven Hedin, who held complex views. In the interwar years, he was arguably Sweden's most famous figure. He maintained a friendship with China while defending the unequal treaties, but his close ties to Nazi Germany also aligned him more closely with Japan. Thus, in 1937, the future divisions were still ambiguous. For example, the Swedish press did not associate the Tenno's Empire with the fascist regimes of Hitler and Mussolini. The term Japan and the Axis powers was used frequently up until 1941. Meanwhile, the optimism of internationalists began to wane, with only a few still believing in the effectiveness of the League of Nations or in multilateral cooperation for small countries. The dark turn of events in Europe amplified the calls for a more cautious and self-sufficient foreign policy, and the situation in Asia fueled these demands. From July 1937 onward, there wasn't a day that passed without news of the escalating conflict between China and Japan. By August, most readers had come to recognize that these hostilities were part of the most significant war since 1918. That same month, Pearl Buck's acclaimed novel, The Good Earth, which portrays family life in rural China, premiered in Stockholm cinemas, sparking sympathy for a China that was once again under attack. As in 1931, discussions arose regarding the Sino-Japanese War, the League of Nations, and the threat to global peace. Journalists and commentators often disagreed on many points, except when it came to Japan's role as a central force in these events. The conversations in 1937 marked a stark contrast to those 6 years prior. Only a few far-right extremists still clung to the belief that Japan had a benevolent motive behind its actions, viewing it positively due to its exit from the League and its declared anti-communism. For instance, the Nya Dagbladet Allehanda, a publication for this group, published an article asserting that pacifism had no place in East Asia, and that Japan's policy in the Far East cannot be judged by European standards. Their entire mindset is different. According to the newspaper, the majority of the Chinese populace craved peace and stability, which Japan was supposedly ready to provide. Ironically, this was the very narrative Japanese diplomats had promoted following the Manchurian incident, one that their government hoped the world would accept. A notable divide existed between ultra-conservatives and the outright National Socialists, the Swedish Nazi Party, who were heavily influenced by racial ideologies and thus held aversion towards Japan. Their publication, Den Svenska Nationalsocialisten, framed the conflict in China through a conspiratorial lens, reminiscent of the German propaganda paper, Der Stürmer, which portrayed the war as part of an elaborate scheme for world domination, orchestrated by the Mongolian race over many generations. For Europeans, it was crucial that colonial rule persisted. If Scandinavia and Britain could recover after centuries of decline, there would still be some hope for then the so-called Yellow Peril would directly threaten the West. Most of the Swedish press did not adopt this kind of rhetoric. The socialist newspapers expressed concern. In Göteborg's Handels- och Sjöfartstidning, Japan faced harsh criticism as an imitator of Germany, and especially Italy, known for seizing through force what they couldn't achieve through diplomacy. From early on, Japan's invasion was referred to as a foray, with few believing Japan could fully conquer China. The Nya Dagligt Allehanda took a more tempered stance, reporting with a realist perspective, typical of its approach to global issues. The mainstream media primarily worried that the group of hungry states would launch a war against weaker democracies, potentially sparking another world war. Liberal publications shared this concern, but Torgny Segerstedt framed the dilemma in a rather troubling manner. If no Western power intervened against Japan, it would signal the decline of white dominance. Japan would gain control over East Asia, the world's largest market, and inspire uprisings among colored populations in Africa. This would effectively end British and other colonial empires, which his newspaper characterized as bad news for Sweden. Göteborg's Handels- och Sjöfartstidning, which had once criticized Western colonialism, seemed to have reversed its position, now asserting that British and French rule was indeed beneficial, providing Sweden with security in a dangerous world. If the West couldn't act from a position of strength, its business interests in the East would fail. Suddenly, racial solidarity became a priority for this publication, worried that Asians might unite under Japanese leadership. Conversely, Segerstedt's liberal newspaper also championed democracy, with articles that were articulate and quite different from the crude style of Nazi propaganda. Yet, opinions on the Sino-Japanese War among them showcased remarkable similarities. There was considerably less debate in Parliament. The deteriorating global situation and the unreliable system of collective security had led to profound disillusionment among internationalist members of Parliament, who were usually the most eager to engage in discussions about foreign policy. The lone standout was Carl Lindhagen, the oldest member of the Swedish Parliament. While he was nominally affiliated with the Social Democratic Party, his speeches on Little Japan, overpopulated and deprived of natural resources, deviated significantly from party lines. Although he advocated for peace, he also embraced a strong Pan-Asianist perspective and held a deep skepticism towards Western colonial power. This may explain his peculiar claim that Japan had recuperated Manchuria for the Mongolian nation. Lindhagen was a left-wing maverick who chose to adopt and disseminate Japan's narrative as the sole great power in Asia, challenging Western colonialism and the so-called lawlessness of China. Ironically, this was the same narrative that ultra-rightists promoted, albeit for very different reasons. In general, Swedish party leaders increasingly neglected discussions about Asia in their public speeches, focusing instead on the threatening developments in Europe. As many warned, the failure of the League to address the Manchurian crisis set a troubling precedent for Europe. Today, the Sino-Japanese War is most infamous for horrors like the Nanking Massacre. However, during the war, the Swedish press predominantly covered other matters. A significant amount of attention was given to aerial warfare. The bombings of major cities, such as Shanghai, Nanking, and Chongqing, sparked a wave of furious protests across Europe. It didn't take much imagination to see that civilian bombings could become a reality in another European war. In fact, it was already happening in Spain, horrifyingly illustrated by Franco's destruction of Guernica in the Basque Country. European protests typically arose from socialists, liberals, and Christian pacifists, driven by an almost sacred outrage from their emotional ties to missionaries in China. Overall, this was the same ideological spectrum that had opposed Japanese actions and voiced dissent during the Manchurian crisis. Foreign Minister Rickard Sandler faced pressure from peace organizations clamoring for him to present petitions, statements, and resolutions condemning the indiscriminate bombings in China's major cities. On the 9th of October, the Swedish Committee of the International Peace Campaign paid him a visit, urging the swift enforcement of the League Covenant to impose trade restrictions on Japan. At the same time, the Ecumenical Board of Sweden began raising funds for war refugees and medical supplies under the banner the China Aid. In just 4 months, they gathered CK 170,000, a commendable amount. Chinese envoy Wang Jingqi warmly commended the Swedish initiative in a letter to his government. Sandler, while not entirely opposed to the movement, remained steadfast in resisting its calls. He believed that trade issues should remain distinct from ideological beliefs, which aligned with Sweden's official stance. Many anti-war activists feared that the League of Nations would again remain inactive and that independent efforts were necessary. This set the stage for a consumer boycott against Japan. Both supporters and critics brought forth a range of arguments, inspired by similar sentiments in the English-speaking world. For instance, a significant meeting took place in Albert Hall in Great Britain on the 5th of October, 1937, where Labour Party representatives urged consumers to avoid Japanese products, and the Archbishop of Canterbury condemned the air raids over China as barbaric. In the United States, the American Federation of Labor was also organizing a trade boycott. These efforts were fueled by the belief that dictatorships were facing severe economic challenges, suggesting that consumer boycotts could make a significant impact. The discourse around trade and ethics was vibrant in 1937 and 1938. The global boycott movement quickly reached Sweden, where the Social Democrats released reports detailing the struggles of the financially and socially undermined Japanese empire. They referenced Freda Utley, a prominent figure in the consumer movement and a strong critic of Japan. While many in this movement sought to voice their dissatisfaction with the League's ineffective sanctions system, some even accusing it of appeasement, there was also a deeply rooted belief in the potential of ordinary people. Some aimed to revive the idea of a workers' blockade, a grassroots form of sanctions. In Gothenburg, the Association of Free-Minded Women issued a manifesto urging Swedish, British, and American consumers to refrain from purchasing Japanese products. On October 8th, just 3 days after the rally in London, the Swedish Federation of Trade Unions and the board of the Social Democratic Party expressed their support for this call. It was evident to many that actually implementing the boycott would be quite challenging. Without clear labeling on products, how could consumers identify which items were genuinely Japanese? Yet, those backing the boycott rarely considered the practical obstacles they were facing. There was a widespread belief that Japan's economy was in dire straits, leading some activists to think that the situation would fix itself with a bit of outside assistance. However, the outlook for the boycott wasn't promising. The LO had previously initiated a trade boycott against Germany in 1933, lacking official support from the Social Democratic Party, and that effort had largely failed. This led notable internationalists, such as Ellen Wegner, a champion of women's rights, to dismiss the new boycott aimed at Japan. She argued that attempts to hinder trade would not aid Japanese opposition, but could instead strengthen the militaristic forces within Japan. The population would likely unify behind their government. Others lamented the lack of conversation between Western liberals and Japanese anti-militarists, and representatives of organized labor raised concerns about potential job losses in Europe if a boycott turned into a trade conflict. Naturally, Swedish exports also faced scrutiny. Moritz Enander, the editor of an organization focused on international peace, indirectly accused Sweden of contributing to Japanese military efforts. He pointed out that Sweden's most popular goods in Japan were crucial for warfare. While exports to Japan brought in revenue, they weren't vital for Sweden's economy, as Swedish industry was already overwhelmed with orders, suggesting to Enander a certain complacency towards Japan's actions. An intriguing aspect of this discussion involved a different campaign against the Tokyo Olympic Games planned for 1940. Should a nation that was invading its neighbor be allowed to host such a prominent international event focused on peace? In the summer of 1938, the Swedish Olympic Committee received an open letter from various youth organizations, including some Christian and abstainer groups, questioning Sweden's involvement in activities that would clearly serve as propaganda for Japan. Before the debate could truly take off, the topic faded from view. In July 1938, Japan gave up its right to host the Olympics, likely not due to Western outrage, but because the financial burden of building an arena would strain the national budget, especially when the Army and Navy were the top priorities. Although there was some momentum behind the boycott movement, it never gained the support of most Swedes. Many were doubtful about consumer actions, including Göteborg's Handels och Sjöfartstidning, which chose not to address the issue in its editorials. Liberal newspapers pointed out the futility of attempts to isolate Japan. The desire to boycott Japan quickly faded in Britain. Business leaders and most newspapers opposed the movement, read a headline from October 15, 1937. Torgny Segerstedt had pushed for Western action against Tokyo, but seemed to favor political solutions that would not primarily harm trade, considering his newspaper represented Gothenburg's commercial interests. Right-wing publications like Nya Dagligt Allehanda mocked peace activists who thought they could fix one problem with another. A nation at war wouldn't sign a truce simply because a handful of foreign nations expressed their moral outrage. The paper suggested that those worried about aerial bombardments in Europe should instead look to Bofors, the Swedish maker of modern anti-aircraft guns. The criticism was echoed by conservative chairman Gösta Bagge, who dismissed the movement as private foreign policy, believing it interfered with the work of diplomats and could do more harm than good. Ultimately, interest in a consumer boycott against Japan waned, overshadowed by outrage over the situation in the Spanish Civil War. The issue was briefly revisited during parliamentary sessions in the spring of 1938 when the communists called for mandatory labeling of imported goods, but their request was declined as it violated existing agreements. In the end, the movement disappeared without any evidence of affecting Swedish foreign trade, and soon news about Japan's war in China quieted down. Sporadic reports continued to emerge about gas attacks on Chinese troops and civilians, and by autumn 1938, detailed accounts of the Nanking massacre began to appear in some newspapers, though they garnered little attention. After a year, the initial outrage had waned, and the Eastern conflict was overshadowed by nearer issues. Chamberlain was now en route to Munich. In sharp contrast to the boycott movement, the Swedish business community maintained a fundamental optimism about trade, even advocating for Japan. Swedish entrepreneurs regarded Japan as a stabilizing force in the East, while they often depicted China as plagued by reckless nationalism leading towards Sovietization. This perspective was particularly prevalent in Sweden before 1931, and the business community did not significantly alter its views after the Mukden incident. Most Swedish companies operating in China seemed to embrace the Japanese conquest, although they had mixed feelings about the realities of military occupation. Some expressed concerns that the open-door policy would be eliminated and that the Japanese would establish themselves as the new rulers of the Middle Kingdom, gradually limiting Western opportunities. Such sentiments are evident in a letter from autumn 1938 by Sigurd Ingvavuren, who was an executive with the American Far Eastern Match Company in Shanghai, a subsidiary of the Swedish Match Corporation. Uren expressed worry about the future after the war, but largely blamed the Western powers for the current situation, accusing them of supporting the undemocratic Nanking regime and missing the chance for dialogue with Japan. He also believed that the Chinese in Manchuria and other regions would fare better under foreign rule than their own government. Nevertheless, he didn't hold much hope for Swedish prospects in the country. A different viewpoint came from a representative of Ekman Foreign Agencies Limited, who was optimistic about a possible Japanese victory and saw it as a unique market opportunity for foreign firms already present in China. This liberal ideology maintained a clear divide between politics and business, positing that most trade was inherently apolitical. They were not particularly worried about the political or moral implications of business opportunities, even in a conflict-driven environment. One Swedish supporter of Japan's actions was Robert Thune from Gedelius. He asserted that Japan's economy was robust and dismissed any claims of inflation, believing that the Japanese people were behind their government, which he claimed had no intentions of territorial expansion. Like the leftist politician Carl Lindhagen, Thune added his voice to the narrative that a nation with such a large population naturally needed more resources. He viewed communism and fascism as foreign ideologies to Japan, maintaining that foreigners were still treated well. Other Swedish business leaders in Japan shared this perspective. For example, Gösta Guston, representing SKF and serving as Sweden's honorary consul in Yokohama, wrote an article in 1939 for Svensk Tidskrift, stating that through the management of China's resources and benevolent treatment of its people, Japan aimed to elevate living standards to the point where the Chinese could purchase Japanese goods and adopt a more cordial attitude toward the new order. Guston, too, focused solely on economic factors. He saw China's invasion as a mere strategy for providing a market for Japanese products and enhancing the purchasing power of Chinese consumers. He identified the true threat as communism, represented by Chiang Kai-shek. Guston aligned with the Japanese government's view, categorizing Chiang as a communist scourge. He suggested that the Japanese intended to control China through advanced motorization and air power, asserting that such occupation forces wouldn't need to be overly large to maintain order. His primary concern was business, rather than the welfare of civilians. On the 5th of October, 1937, during a meeting with prominent Swedish businessmen and the new envoy to Japan, Vidar Bagge, Guston elaborated on his hopeful outlook, indicating that the war had created avenues to sell significantly more steel to Japan than before. Others in the meeting were critical, though not towards Japan's actions. Niels Eriksson, the representative from Carl Ekman and Company, bluntly pointed out that the biggest hurdle to successful business in this market was the unfortunate effect of Sweden's current political stance towards Japan, referring specifically to Sweden's criticism at the League of Nations. Envoy Bagge attempted to deflect the issue by stating that foreign policy was not on the meeting's agenda. However, Eriksson insisted that Swedish foreign policy was relevant, noting that in Manchukuo, the Japanese clearly preferred the Germans over the Swedes. Guston disagreed, arguing that the Japanese bought what they needed, regardless of the country of origin. Ultimately, Bagge shifted the focus by pledging to do whatever was necessary to support Swedish commerce, particularly in Japan and Manchukuo. The October meeting illustrated not only the Japan-friendly stance of Swedish businesses in the empire, but also how diplomacy, policy, and trade began to intersect as the security situation in East Asia deteriorated. This was a particularly sensitive moment, given that Sweden did not recognize Manchukuo or any changes in China resulting from force. Envoy Bagge found himself navigating between the stance of his government and the expectations of the business community. Compared to his predecessor, J.E. Hultman, Bagge was clearly more eager to foster closer ties, not just with Swedish businesses in Japan, but also with regions in East Asia under Japan's de facto control. He even offered to engage the Parliamentary Treaty Committee about trade with Manchukuo, aiming to request a report on potential measures for establishing state control over soybean imports. His plan was to use such a document as leverage with the Gaimusho to assist Swedish exporters in Manchukuo. Despite this ambitious commitment, he found it challenging to appease the restless Swedish businessmen. By spring 1938, Bagge expressed frustration that Guston, Eriksson, and Ingemar Tenberg, the Gedelius representative, had taken matters into their own hands by entering into direct negotiations with Manchukuo's authorities, particularly Director Matsushima Kan of the Manchurian Agricultural Product Institute. Guston, serving as the Swedish honorary consul, had assured Bagge that he wouldn't venture beyond the port city of Dairen in the Kanto leased territory, which Japan controlled. However, he chose to ignore that promise and traveled to Shinking, the capital of Manchuria. This blatant act of defiance prompted Bagge to write a letter to the UD to explain the situation and issue an apology. Fortunately, the incident gained little international attention, and there's no indication that Guston or the other businessmen faced any official consequences. Ultimately, Bagge and the business community shared common goals in Swedish trade diplomacy, even if their methods sometimes differed. Another significant event took place in the spring of 1938 when Axel Wenner-Gren, a prominent financial magnate and chairman of Electrolux, arrived in Tokyo aboard his luxurious yacht, drawing considerable media attention. For Japanese newspapers, it was a lavish moment amid wartime constraints. He reportedly declared intentions to send a full Swedish trade delegation to Japan and Manchukuo, though he also mentioned he was not directly related to this matter. Wenner-Gren discussed exchanging Swedish steel for Manchurian soybeans and expressed that he would hold important talks with Foreign Minister Hirota and Trade Minister Yoshino. Bagge, understandably frustrated, had to quickly clarify that Wenner-Gren was not representing the Swedish government as he had implied. This incident illustrates that Swedish business interests remained largely unfazed by Japan's aggression in China. The ongoing conflict did little to dampen their enthusiasm for commerce, especially when it appeared to create new opportunities. When hostilities at the Marco Polo Bridge erupted, the future of a collective security effort through the League of Nations was uncertain. The previous attempt to impose sanctions against Italy had ended in failure. Stockholm primarily looked to London and Paris to see if they would commit military resources to East Asia, but neither great power seemed willing to risk confrontation. This hesitation became the cornerstone of a cautious Swedish foreign policy. On September 2nd, 1937, the Chinese minister to Switzerland, Hu Shi's, sought support for his nation's account of the incident. However, the Swedish envoy, Carl Ivan Westman, couldn't commit to any diplomatic actions. Privately, he acknowledged the reality of the situation, noting in his report that the conflicts in China amounted to a genuine war, even without an official declaration. This clearly fell under the League's jurisdiction according to Article 16 of the Covenant. Yet, his government was hesitant about any commitments. It was only after the League started to discuss the matter that Stockholm considered its response. Unsurprisingly, their stance remained unclear and ambiguous. They reached a compromise. Sweden would support a strong position against Japan, but it would do so discreetly. Westman was instructed that the government was willing to follow the League's guidelines, but only based on past experiences of their implementation. He was to critique Japan but not call for any specific actions, as Stockholm was reluctant to risk itself by advocating for sanctions. This careful strategy sharply contrasted with the consensus in 1932, which favored robust support for the League's collective security efforts. By 1937, Swedish hopes for the League had diminished significantly. It's important to note that this cautious approach faced internal opposition. Numerous internationalist parliamentarians, particularly from the Social Democrats, held strong anti-Japanese views and sought a firmer stance for Sweden in Geneva, detesting Tokyo's imperialism. Additionally, concerns among unionized workers regarding low-wage competition from Asia further tarnished Japan's reputation. Even the Prime Minister backed denouncing Japan's wartime tactics. On September 28, 1937, the League passed a resolution against aerial bombardment, which ultimately aligned with the UD's cautious strategy, sparing Sweden from having to take an independent initiative. On September 30th, Sweden was chosen for one of the subcommittees of the 23-member committee, formed by the League in 1933 to address the Manchuria conflict. This situation added another layer of complexity for Swedish diplomats. "We didn't do anything to push for a spot on the subcommittee, but we were nominated," Westman reported. The decision to accept this nomination came after consulting Östen Undén, who agreed to represent Sweden. Undén had not surrendered his activist spirit and aimed to take a firm stance. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, he urged the subcommittee to take a bold approach by calling for a declaration that would assert Japan's use of force on Chinese territory, thus violating the League's covenant. If this proposal had been accepted, Japan would have faced renewed scrutiny as a violator of Article 16. However, no one, not even the Soviet delegate, seemed prepared to go that far. The British representative argued that the situation in China was complex and highlighted Japan's treaty rights to maintain troops in China. With no backing from any great power, Undén was fighting a losing battle. The established positions from 1932 remained unchanged. The subcommittee's resolution, passed in a plenary session on October 6th, did not call for sanctions. Its only notable aspect was that it avoided compromising with Japan's stance. Members were asked to refrain from actions that could undermine China's ability to resist Japan. This allowed the League to claim moral support for China, aligning with the UD's preferences. Yet, the The resolution also included a clause for further discussions under the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922, which meant Sweden as a signatory would have to face renewed attention, an unwelcome prospect for the cautious UD. Throughout the conference preparations, it was again Unden who voiced the most optimism at the UD. He proposed a policy outlining how Sweden could positively impact global affairs, countering the negative views expressed by the Norwegian foreign minister. He still believed in the principle of collective security, though this perspective remained a minority opinion. Most of his colleagues were significantly less enthusiastic. Even Foreign Minister Sandler didn't think much of the conference. Hans Beck Friis, who led the political section at the UD, hoped the conference would clarify the difference between the original signatories and those countries that joined the treaty later, like Sweden. This would have allowed the Swedish delegation to take a passive stance on political matters. To him, the only benefit of the conference was the opportunity to address commercial navigation in the Far East. To be fair, Sweden wasn't alone in its tepid response. Several smaller nations had instructed their representatives not to take any initiatives. The signals from France and Britain were anything but encouraging, with some commentators already suggesting this conference could turn into a second non-intervention committee, a policy that had allowed the aggressor Francisco Franco to benefit during the Spanish Civil War. Unlike before, Unden wasn't chosen to lead the Swedish delegation this time. Following Denmark's lead, Stockholm appointed its envoy to Brussels, the experienced diplomat Gustaf von Dardel, along with just one aide, Secretary C.F. Wachtmeister. In stark contrast, three of the great powers sent their foreign ministers, Anthony Eden from Britain, Ivan Delbos from France, and Maxim Litvinov from the Soviet Union. France and Britain also brought along more than a dozen high-ranking officials and diplomats. The United States sent one of its top negotiators, Ambassador to the League of Nations Norman Davis, along with 3 additional diplomats. Sweden's minimal presence clearly communicated that it wasn't considering any meaningful initiatives. The conference faced larger issues beyond Sweden's disinterest. When it kicked off on November 3, 1937, a crucial seat at the table remained unoccupied. Japan was not present, as Tokyo asserted that the conference was organized by the League of Nations, which it had withdrawn from and deemed unfriendly in several resolutions. Contrary to expectations, Britain, France, and the United States took a strong position, affirming that the conflict in the Far East was indeed pertinent for the treaty powers and for the world as a whole. They noted that while China was ready for discussions, Japan was not. Their proposed resolution called for the treaty powers to create a joint policy against any nation that failed to recognize its international responsibilities, subtly aimed at Japan. This time, the small countries were taken by surprise. Unlike before, they were the ones seeking to soften the wording. Sweden suggested removing the word joint from the declaration, but the Norwegians found this still too extreme. Ultimately, Norway and Denmark chose to abstain from the vote, and Sandler instructed von Dardel to follow suit. The Scandinavians affirmed their basic agreement, but noted they lacked the same political interests in the Far East as other powers. Despite the 3 abstentions, the declaration was adopted on November 16th, with 15 countries in favor and 1 against, Italy. Stockholm's change in stance was notable. Only weeks earlier, Unden had pushed hard for a resolution condemning Japan's actions as illegal, but now Sweden appeared to abandon its stance as a moral great power. The Chinese response came swiftly, as Nanking accused the Swedish delegate of being pro-Japanese, leading to a protest from the Republic of China in Stockholm. Through its legation in Shanghai, the Swedish government sought to calm the Chinese, stating that although it supported the Brussels resolution, it did not vote affirmatively because it was not part of the inner circle of treaty powers. This explanation was weak, considering that other smaller nations like Belgium had voted for the declaration. There were also critical reactions from the League Secretariat in Geneva, even though its officials were not supposed to take political sides. F.P. Walters, a key figure in the League bureaucracy, questioned Envoy Westman about the reasoning behind Sweden's new position, but did not receive a clear response. For the final round of conference talks regarding the committee's actions, the UD directed von Dardel to remain passive in all scenarios, except when such passivity could be seen as silent agreement for action. Whenever necessary, he was expected to point out the need for consulting with Stockholm. This approach, or lack thereof, was clearly orchestrated by Sandler rather than Unden. The Scandinavians were relieved to see that the proposed final declaration did not manifest into tangible sanctions against Japan. Even the Norwegian delegate raised only minor objections to a few formalities. Sandler, in discussions with Delbos, emphasized the importance of adapting to realities and described the document as completely harmless. The second Brussels declaration was passed smoothly, aside from a singular negative vote from Italy, and on the 24th of November, the conference was indefinitely adjourned. Sweden maintained such a low profile throughout the conference that von Dardel didn't give a single speech. Unsurprisingly, Chiang Kai-shek's government expressed its deep disappointment. Envoy Hu Shi's, in Switzerland, attributed the Scandinavian neutrality to adverse influences from Norwegian politicians, and wryly noted that the common policy of the Scandinavian delegates had been to book their tickets home. In contrast, the Japanese media reacted with surprise and excitement, with Ambassador Kurusu Saburo even stating that the Scandinavians' lack of reaction was a key factor in the conference's failure. Within Sweden, the official position encountered little opposition. Göteborg's Handels och Sjöfartstidning claimed it would have been lunacy to support British statements that weren't taken seriously. Whether this was an act of caution, timidity, or straightforward realism, the unfortunate truth was that yet another effort at conflict management had devolved into total failure. Instead of discovering ways to support the Republic of China, the conference conveyed to the world that both major and minor powers accepted the status quo in the East, showing a reluctance to provide assistance. By the late 1930s, the winds were shifting in favor of the Axis powers. The League of Nations officially distanced itself from the Treaty of Versailles, yet many countries, including Sweden, acknowledged Italy's takeover of Ethiopia, which was against the covenant. At the same time, Germany and Italy recognized Manchukuo. Other nations, particularly Great Britain, were anticipated to do the same, but London refrained due to rising tensions with Japan in 1939. Sweden, too, did not recognize Manchukuo, and after 1937, the base of Swedish diplomatic efforts in China, Shanghai, fell under Japanese control. Envoy Johann Beck-Fries was recalled in 1939, and Foreign Minister Sandler opted not to appoint a replacement. This left Swedish interests in the hands of temporary representatives for 5 years. Stockholm also chose not to establish diplomatic ties with Wang Jingwei's national government or any regime aligned with Japan. However, Japan's aggressive moves prompted Sweden to reconsider some policies from its colonial past. Premier Konoe's renowned radio speech on November 3, 1938, introducing his new order in Asia, sparked discussions regarding the outdated treaties still in place, particularly trade and navigation agreements forged with China after the Opium War. China had long aimed to revise or eliminate these unequal treaties, and now, ironically, it was also part of Japan's policy. In Sweden, a confidential assessment of potentially repealing the treaty with China had started as early as 1937, focusing on the concept of extraterritoriality, which kept foreigners from being governed by local law. While the findings suggested it wasn't quite time for a change, after Konoe's address, Swedish leaders began to move away from their colonial perspective. When Sweden signed a new trade agreement with Siam in 1938, it was based on the principles of full equality. The discourse surrounding Far Eastern issues continued in Swedish media, with the Japanese government monitoring public sentiment in Scandinavia but shying away from political propaganda, unlike Germany, which actively sought to shape public opinion through various channels. Tokyo did not even issue a diplomatic protest after the Swedish delegation supported the League's resolutions of 1937. At that time, Japan likely viewed the League as inconsequential and deemed dialogue with Sweden unnecessary. The conflict in China posed new challenges for Swedish diplomats on the ground. In wartime, just like in natural disasters, governments have the responsibility to protect their citizens and often act to defend their interests. Initially, Sweden only needed to assist a few residents in the coastal areas of China, where the danger was greatest. However, the situation quickly escalated as more Swedes, primarily missionaries, required urgent protection from the crossfire between Chinese and Japanese forces, and their properties suffered damage from air raids. The business communities in the treaty ports also faced a sharp decline in their economic prospects due to the worsening security conditions. During the battle for Shanghai, a Swedish sailor lost his life, and many Swedish properties were either destroyed or harmed. Once Japanese forces established control, the situation didn't improve much. Foreigners became targets of suspicion. Notably, one Swedish businessman, K.G. Söderblom, was arrested on espionage charges. The Swedish government responded with emergency measures that included selective evacuations, never contemplating a full evacuation of all Swedes, property protection, and occasional diplomatic protests against hostile actions, alongside other nations. Japan's military operations in China began to clash with the interests of European and American neutrals. For instance, the sea blockade of China violated international law, prompting strong opposition from Western powers that sought to protect their concessions in China with their navies, leading to further conflicts. A significant event occurred when the Japanese Navy attacked and sank the U.S. gunboat, the USS Panay, along with 3 American merchant ships on the Yangtze River on December 12, 1937. This incident provoked a fierce protest from Washington, particularly since the Panay was clearly marked with the U.S. flag, making an accidental hit unlikely. To this day, there remains no evidence that the sinking was part of a strategy authorized by the Japanese government. There are ongoing speculations that the attack was carried out by rogue officers from the Japanese Navy looking to instigate conflict. Since Tokyo did not support military actions against neutral nations, the Gaimusho quickly issued an apology and agreed to pay reparations, thus preventing further tension with the United States. In contrast, Sweden typically took care not to get embroiled in the disputes or provoke Tokyo with its objections. When Japan announced its intention to inspect the vessels of neutral nations on the high seas for contraband, Sweden diplomatically noted that it did not see these wartime actions as unprecedented. The Swedish government likely recalled that Britain had adopted a similar stance during its blockade of Germany in World War I. Over the next 3 years, Sweden made concerted efforts to adhere to Japanese directives to avoid political confrontations regarding seized ships, albeit at the cost of its own merchant fleet's freedom of movement. A new challenge arose in September 1937 when Japan requested a list of Swedish cultural institutions such as schools, churches, and hospitals located in China. At first, Stockholm was reluctant to share this information, concerned about potential repercussions for these institutions. In a note dated October 4th, the Foreign Ministry responded that Swedish property had already suffered damage in Shanghai and that they reserved the right to seek reparations. In response, Tokyo distanced itself from any responsibility for damages that might occur if it was not informed about the locations of Swedish properties ahead of time. Given the real risks of bombings or looting, the Swedish government ultimately decided to provide some lists to the Japanese, indicating Swedish establishments in conflict zones, but without detailed maps. They stressed that international law forbids air raids on civilian sites, so Japan did not need to know the precise locations of churches and schools. Furthermore, they refused to share a complete inventory of properties, as this could be seen as Sweden anticipating a Japanese victory in the war. Lastly, while threats to Swedish citizens and property primarily came from Japan, the Swedish government recognized that transgressions from the Chinese side couldn't be dismissed either. Aware that international law required neutral states to maintain impartiality, Minister Sandler emphasized the importance of equal diplomatic conduct towards both parties. In March 1938, a warning about potential Swedish claims for indemnities was sent to both the Japanese and Chinese governments. However, because of the nature of the aggressive conflict, most issues arose primarily with Japan. While theoretically this stance shouldn't have favored either side, in reality, Sweden's diplomatic protests mostly benefited China. Disputes over war damage with Japan were common, but relations with the Republic of China were generally smooth, with Swedish diplomats rarely needing to step in with Chinese authorities. The year 1937 began on a high note for Swedish businesses in East Asia, thriving until summer. Export and import orders from Japan and China reached unprecedented levels, keeping the Ostatiska Kompaniet so busy that it had to charter foreign vessels to meet demand. But once fighting broke out in China, Sweden's trade interests took a significant hit. The collapse of Shanghai's foreign trade and Japan's decision to impose import licensing were particularly jarring. The flow of Swedish wood pulp to East Asia and soy products back home was directly threatened. The waters off the Chinese coast became perilous, and freight costs soared as risk compensation fees for sailors and insurance premiums rose. Ostasiatiska Kompaniet was especially affected, as it was in the process of expanding its fleet with the MS Nippon and MS Ningpo, soon to be launched after considerable investment. The onset of warfare negatively impacted ship owners across the board. Swedish vessels operating in Chinese waters had to be painted bright red to avoid accidental bombings by the Japanese Air Force. In August, China declared that certain sections of the Yangtze River would be closed to foreign ships. Japan retaliated by imposing a blockade against all Chinese vessels between the 23rd and 32nd latitudes, which soon expanded to the entire coastline. Japan asserted the right to detain ships of unclear nationality, meaning European and American vessels faced inspections at sea. Assurances from Tokyo that the peaceful trade of neutral countries would remain unhindered were often met with doubt and turned out to be empty promises, as even after conquering the Yangtze River Valley, only Japanese ships were permitted to navigate freely. In August 1938, a Japanese destroyer captured the MS Ningpo, leading to the interrogation of its crew. This incident underscored Japan's position as a dominant power in the region. Yet, the empire faced significant challenges. Japan was running low on foreign currency and mandated that trading companies accept at least half of their payments in yen. This posed a problem for ship owners who had little need for Japanese money. Additionally, Tokyo insisted that imported goods must be transported on Japanese ships, threatening to revoke import licenses if they didn't comply. Meanwhile, Nippon Yusen Kaisha, the Japanese shipping line, sought a bigger share of the foreign market and pushed for access to Scandinavian ports. On November 19, 1938, a deal was struck between NYK and Ostasiatiska Kompaniet, with Danish and Norwegian partners, allowing the Japanese company up to 6 departures a year. By the end of the month, residents of Gothenburg saw the Yasukuni Maru loading 1,500 tons of rayon pulp at their port. The contentious arms trade with China also continued past 1937, straining relations between Stockholm and Tokyo. China imported gunpowder and the highly prized Bofors anti-aircraft guns. The League of Nations resolutions from 1933 and 1938 justified this weapons export, stating that China had the right to foreign armaments. For Sweden, this rationale was a convenient way to maintain a steady profit from the arms trade. Sweden wasn't alone in this business. Germany and Soviet Russia mainly sold weapons to China, while American companies supplied Japan, and Great Britain served both sides. Furthermore, Sweden provided China with medical supplies and surgical equipment. The self-interested nature of Swedish firms worked both ways. On September 4, 1937, Sandler met with Japanese envoy Kuriyama to discuss the naval blockade of China, and the sensitive issue of arms exports to Chiang's government came up. When Kuriyama inquired whether Swedish vessels shipped arms to China, Sandler confidently stated that, to his knowledge, no such shipments were occurring. Sandler's response was quite evasive, knowing that most Swedish arms simply found their way onto German ships. The envoy didn't pursue the matter further, but Sandler was ready to argue that Sweden had the right to issue export licenses to its weapons industry. The Japanese were aware that Sweden was aiding China's defense, yet it was clear that Swedish companies also supplied crucial materials to Japan's armaments sector, including iron, steel, and ball bearings. Hence, Tokyo never demanded an end to Swedish trade with its adversaries, as doing so could harm Japan's own interests. However, in September 1939, Sweden halted arms trade with China after implementing national emergency laws that prioritized domestic defense. Foreign orders were cancelled, and the journey to Asia became perilous once the British and French colonial empires joined the European conflict. In February 1940, the Östasiatiska Kompaniet announced plans to ship Swedish gunpowder to China on the steamer Formosa. But just weeks later, the war zone expanded and mines were laid in Skagerrak, crippling Swedish maritime transport. The last recorded request for Swedish arms from China came on September 27, 1940. Despite the worsening situation at sea, Swedish policymakers initially remained optimistic about global trade. A 1938 report from the Export Trade Commission suggested that outside Europe, the United States, Argentina, and Japan would become Sweden's key export markets. This optimism for Japan primarily hinged on record trade figures from the previous year, which saw exports more than double. However, the reality was that trade was declining. Traditional Japanese exports like textiles became less significant to the war economy after 1937, resulting in reduced production and fewer goods available for export. Additionally, as conflict with China escalated, barriers to imports increased, complicating the delivery of Swedish products to East Asian consumers. Japan had previously been a market where Swedish businesses operated without restrictions like quotas or currency limits, but the conflict disrupted those conditions. Japan began to restrict imports through a new licensing system, which significantly altered the priority and order of various product categories. Until 1937, Japan primarily imported paper, cardboard, and pulp valued at 24.6 million sei, base metals in their products, mainly ball bearings worth 17.3 million sei, and machines and tools valued at 4.5 million sei. By October, currency restrictions nearly halted imports of timber and its derivatives, as well as cellulose for paper production. As Japan's industries were nationalized, non-essential imports were cut off to focus on the armament sector, leading to a staggering 50% drop in Swedish-Japanese trade value in 1938. The statistical data illustrates the commercial downturn in East Asia. In 1937, 143,000 tons of goods were sent to China and Japan, but the next year saw this figure dive below 38,000 tons. Though there was a slight rebound in imports, the overall pace of trade slowed, culminating in the grounding of Swedish vessels in 1939. The onset of war in Europe further complicated matters for Swedish shipping firms. By spring 1940, the Skagerrak barrage disrupted what was once normal transoceanic trade, including Japanese shipping to Scandinavia. Despite these challenges, a business magazine noted that as late as 1939, Sweden remained the fourth largest exporter to Japan among European nations, largely due to its key contributions to the war industry, particularly ball bearings. These components were vital for manufacturing weapons, cannons, machine guns, tanks, submarines, and fighter planes, creating strong demand. SKF's dominant position in Asian markets enabled the company to establish a near monopoly by lowering local prices, a tactic described by Envoy Widar Bag as Japanese methods, often paired with generous credit for customers. However, SKF was the exception. Overall, Swedish businesses faced difficulties amid the rising nationalism and a resurgence of mercantilist principles. In a telegram to the UD in September 1937, Envoy Bagge provided a summary of the situation. Currency restrictions were further tightened on all goods deemed non-essential for military purposes. Imports largely halted, with relevant shipments only occurring if a currency permit was obtainable. The outlook remained positive for Swedish silk, pulp, and cellulose products, which were vital for the Japanese industry. Ideological nationalism had infiltrated the business sector. Bagge's cautious optimism about Sweden's main exports proved to be overly hopeful. Even wood, pulp, and paper commodities quickly succumbed to the new restrictions, nearly disappearing from trade statistics after 1938. Japanese authorities aimed not only to address the persistent trade deficit, but also to boost domestic production of machinery and technology, striving for economic self-sufficiency within the yen bloc, which included Japan, Manchukuo, and occupied China. Fortunately for Swedish companies, these objectives were never fully realized, allowing some level of business to persist. The Japanese government understood that overly stringent import limitations could impede the supply of raw materials and disrupt wartime production. As many Japanese clients canceled orders, Swedish exporters found themselves spending increasing amounts of time at government ministries in Tokyo, nurturing relationships with key decision-makers. This involved regular visits to the Trade Bureau or trips to the Finance Ministry, which had the power to issue import licenses and currency permits. This shift created significant challenges for companies accustomed to private sector practices, requiring them to navigate negotiations with Japanese public officials. Additionally, there was a language barrier. Many Western corporate leaders struggled to communicate in Japanese, as their Japanese counterparts typically spoke English. When critical trade matters fell under the oversight of military personnel lacking foreign language skills, significant obstacles arose in shipment and price negotiations. Gedelius, for example, assigned sensitive issues to local employees responsible for liaising with authorities. An intriguing memorandum in the archives recounts the story of a salesman, Oki Tosezo, who boldly approached the Ministry of Finance in his military uniform, threatening to commit harakiri if he was denied a currency permit essential for importing Sandviken's piano wire, a material used in Japanese machine guns. To address issues like these, various strategies were discussed. Gedelius serves as a prime example of how foreign firms can adapt. Between 1932 and 1938, the company increased its machine exports to Japan 9 times. When Tokyo implemented import restrictions, the trading house sidestepped these quotas by relocating production to Japan. A factory purchase in Kamada, located between Tokyo and Yokohama, enabled the local production of a wide range of goods licensed from Swedish manufacturers while maintaining profitability. Amidst a tense atmosphere of nationalistic trade talks, statistics became a battleground. As bilateralism gained traction, it became crucial to show that trade with a specific nation wasn't overly imbalanced. This prompted Sweden's Statistical Bureau to revise its trade statistics calculation in 1936. For transactions with Japan and China, this adjustment led to a significant increase in reported imports. Goods were now categorized by country of origin instead of country of purchase. This change helped Sweden counter criticisms of contributing more in sales than in purchases in East Asia. A significant portion of imports from these countries flowed through third nations. For Japan, the revised statistics indicated an import value of SEK 14.8 million, up from 10.6 million under the old system. Consequently, export statistics also required adjustments. Exports were now recorded based on the country of consumption rather than the country of sale, resulting in a value close to the previous figure, CK 26.5 million instead of C 26 million. This reshuffling of statistics had a dramatic impact on imports from China, with their values soaring from CK 1.5 million in 1935 to SEK 28.2 million in 1936, a staggering 20-fold increase. Even before 1937, Tokyo often pushed for trade reciprocity, but once the conflict in China erupted, their diplomats began to threaten that Japan would cut imports from Sweden if Stockholm didn't increase its purchases from them. Swedish representatives typically responded that the prices of their goods were already low and profit margins were thin, emphasizing that Japan would struggle to find substitutes for the quality of Swedish products. This argument also helped Swedish diplomats when pressed by their Japanese counterparts to halt trade with the enemy government in Chongqing. When envoy Johann Beck Fries met with the Japanese ambassador, Tani Masayuki, in Shanghai, he simply stated that Swedish exports to China held little value, while exports to Japan, in contrast, were plentiful and highly advantageous for Japan. These points had a partial effect. Although sales dipped after peaking in 1937, they eventually stabilized at levels similar to those during the prosperous years before the conflict in China. In 1938, Sweden sold over SEK 26 million in products to Japan, while imports from Japan reached SEK 15.6 million, surpassing trade with the larger and closer Soviet Union. The Manchurian breakaway state faced significant internal issues. The legitimacy of the government in Shanghai was questioned both domestically and internationally. Armed resistance movements emerged across various regions of Manchukuo against Japanese authority. Meanwhile, authorities and foreign advisors were launching rapid modernization initiatives. New infrastructure plans were set for this overlooked northeastern area of China, and heavy industry expanded. Foreign companies began to arrive, viewing Manchukuo as a promising market for investment and sales. In 1937, the General Export Association of Sweden considered embarking on an information and propaganda tour throughout the country. Almost all major Swedish firms, including SKF, Gedelius, Kellberg, and Ekman, established offices in Manchukuo. Within these circles, it became common to praise the empire for its order and progress, while lamenting the presence of bandits, referring to local resistance fighters. In 1937, estimates from Stockholm indicated that the value of Swedish exports to this new state was around Swedish krona 1-to-1, 5 million. This figure was likely an understatement, as many Swedish shipments first stopped in Japan before reaching their destination. The legation in Tokyo reported a significant surge in trade, and Gedelius alone claimed to have supplied cellulose machines worth 2 million Swedish krona to 5 different paper mills in Manchuria. Of course, these figures weren't officially recognized because officially, Sweden had no economic ties with Manchukuo. However, just as Manchukuo existed in practice, trading companies conducted business with it, resulting in the awkwardness of having Manchukuo's trade figures classified under China. This situation was far from ideal for companies that depended on accurate statistics. In 1936, the General Export Association urged the National Board of Trade to make these trade figures visible, but it took 2 years for the Parliamentary Treaty Committee to agree. Even so, the committee had to tread carefully, stressing that establishing a separate statistical category for Manchukuo wouldn't imply diplomatic recognition. It was a tricky balance between trade and diplomacy, yet there had been precedents like Algeria and the Canary Islands. Consequently, starting in 1939, trade with Manchukuo was openly reported in Swedish statistical abstracts. The Tokyo legation suspected that the real trade volume was around 4 million krona, a belief that was eventually validated. Just like with Japan, an imbalance existed in Sweden's trade with Manchukuo, but in contrast to Japan, Sweden imported significantly more from Manchukuo due to the demand for soybeans. As noted previously, Stockholm used this to its advantage when negotiating with Tokyo. In terms of exports, Sweden's primary customer in Manchukuo was the mining sector, followed by chemical and heavy industries. Various ministries and military institutions in Manchuria placed additional orders. Early in 1937, the emperor's government announced a 5-year plan, leading to a rapid increase in commissions for Swedish firms. Among the most sought-after items were machines for producing paper and cellulose, as well as mining drills and measuring instruments. Although the imposition of import restrictions in September 1937 brought some unwelcome news for business, overall, the policy didn't signify a dramatic shift. Before long, managers Bjorn Pritz and Gusta Gustin from SKF had finalized a ball-bearing deal with Shinking. They also attempted to assist other Swedish companies in securing preferential treatment, but with little success. In 1938, the German Reich and several other countries recognized Manchukuo, diminishing the bargaining power of nations that did not engage diplomatically with this puppet state. Swedish firms often found themselves excluded from agreements due to competition from German businesses. The imperial authorities encouraged Manchurian companies to procure iron and steel from the German Krupp Company and similar firms. The Swedes were also at a disadvantage compared to large American corporations that could organize cashless compensation deals. However, all foreign companies expressed dissatisfaction with the preferential treatment afforded to Japanese enterprises. Generally, Western businesses in Manchukuo operated as usual and competed vigorously, largely unconcerned with the politics and conflict surrounding them. A significant shift in Swedish relations with East Asia occurred in July 1937, when the Marco Polo Bridge incident ignited full-scale warfare between China and Japan. The Japanese army launched attacks on Chinese military positions and targeted the government of Chiang Kai-shek, leading to assaults on cities and ultimately the fall of the capital, Nanking, on December 13th. This city suffered some of the war's most horrific atrocities. These events captured attention in Sweden, where public sentiment was divided. Some expressed outrage, leading to attempts at private boycotts, while others in the business community and among anti-colonial advocates showed implicit support. The League of Nations made further efforts to mediate the conflict, but Japan declined to participate. The League denounced Japan's actions as breaches of both the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the Nine Power Treaty, yet the only notable outcome was Japan's Privy Council severing its remaining connections to the non-political branches of the League on the 2nd of November, 1938. This period marked a noticeable shift in Swedish foreign policy, not just concerning Japan, but also regarding collective security as a whole. Initially, Sweden's diplomats in Geneva aimed to persuade the League to adopt a strong position that could lead to sanctions or military support for China. However, the reluctance of major powers to even consider branding Japan as a violator of Article 16 extinguished the remaining internationalist spirit within Sweden. By the following conference in November, Sweden's lack of involvement and interest bordered on outright obstruction. Within a mere 2 months, Sweden shifted from active engagement to apathy, reflecting a significant foreign policy change towards strict neutrality. This transition not only marked a failure of Sweden's internationalist ambitions, but also created pressing issues, particularly regarding trade. The loss of markets in China and the Japanese takeover impacted trade routes, rendering them unsafe due to the blockade of the Chinese coastline. Shipping became perilous, leading Swedish companies to provide war risk allowances to sailors navigating dangerous paths. Moreover, Swedish missionaries and merchants in China faced pressures from both the Japanese and Chinese, prompting many to evacuate during 1938 and 1939. These conditions naturally took a toll on trade with China, as exports plummeted from 15.4 million in 1937 to 8 million the following year, declining further to 6 million in 1939. Import figures remained stable at about 31 million, but this was misleading, as official statistics continued to classify Manchurian soybeans as Chinese products. In reality, total imports for 1939 amounted to just 5.2 million, only a third of what Sweden imported from Manchukuo, valued at 15.6 million. Trade with Japan also experienced a drastic decline. After a record-breaking year in 1937, with exports reaching Swedish krona 47.8 million, the figure fell sharply to Swedish krona 26.3 million in 1938. This decline wasn't solely due to wartime trade barriers. In 1937, Japan's parliament implemented laws aimed at eliminating trade deficits and boosting domestic production of essential goods, thereby reducing the empire's reliance on foreign imports. As a result, Japan's industries fell under strict control, resembling a nationalization trend. Swedish trading companies found themselves needing to change not just their products, but the way they did business, engaging more with Japanese governmental bodies rather than private industry. As a wave of economic nationalism swept through, the goods that managed to withstand regulatory scrutiny were those hard for Japan to substitute. For instance, ball bearings, where SKF held a near monopoly, along with top-notch machinery, saw a surge in demand, particularly due to the ongoing conflict in China. This situation, however, significantly hampered Swedish interests in the region. Since the onset of open warfare, Bagge had to voice protests to the Gaimusho on behalf of Swedish businesses and the consulate in Shanghai whenever Japanese forces damaged or seized their properties. Unfortunately, these protests rarely had any effect. The prosperous days of Swedish trade in East Asia had come to an end.